This episode of The Business of Agriculture is brought to you by Nori. Feeling left out of carbon markets? Nori is a carbon removal marketplace that welcomes early adopters of regenerative farming. We work directly with farmers to enter their data and project their carbon credits, which the farmer owns and sets the price on. Nori is the marketplace, not the middleman, so farmers get paid directly once their credits are sold. We believe that carbon credits should be an asset the farmer controls, not the rights that they sell. To learn more on how you can enroll your farm, visit nori.com/growers. And if you are a company looking to get involved with carbon markets, reach out to hello@nori.com. Nori, a carbon marketplace for early adopters. Visit nori.com/growers.
Well, greetings and welcome to another fantastic episode of The Business of Agriculture. It's me, your host, Damian Mason. You knew that because you knew that when you tuned in. I already said so in the introduction. Got a great show for you today because I have a great guest. His name is Jack Bobo. Jack and I met each other on the road. He speaks at conferences. He writes books. He does a lot of stuff, and he also has a role now with the Nature Conservancy. So I wanted to bring him in because he always gives really good perspective. Sometimes we disagree, but that's healthy. We're not the kind of people here on the Business of Agriculture who require safe spaces. We think disagreement is good. It means that we're both thinking. Jack's going to talk to us also about his role at the Nature Conservancy and a few other things as it relates to agriculture. You know, one thing that we always try to do, dear listener, is bring in outside perspective. Agriculture is a small fraternity. It also can become an echo chamber. If you spend any time on Twitter, there's a lot of people talking to themselves about themselves. And I always say this about agriculture. If agriculture was a person, we'd be that crazy guy at the park who's like sitting on the park bench muttering to himself because we do a lot of talking to ourselves. So that's why I'm here for you. I'm bringing in people like my man Jack, who gives us outside perspective and some things that maybe you don't normally hear in our jobs in agriculture. Mr. Bobo, thanks for being here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Really glad to be on your program.
All right. So real quickly, you do a better job of your own biographical stuff. The last time I saw you, you gave me your book, Why Smart People Make Bad Food Choices. You're an ag kind of guy who's not really ever been in ag. You're not from a farming background. You went to a liberal arts school, the other state university here in my home state of Indiana called Indiana University. You got a whole bunch of degrees, none of which are in agriculture, but you kind of found your way here after being in the Peace Corps and working in the Washington, D.C. establishment. And here you are now kind of an ag and food guy. Last time I saw you was at a conference in Arizona where you're talking to people that were vegetable. It was a vegetable conference for influencers of all things. So kind of give us the lowdown on what the hell you're doing.
Yeah, thanks. Well, it's great talking to you. I wish I was back in Indiana right now where all my family is. Though, you're right. I didn't grow up in agriculture, but we did have cornfields that literally came up to my back door, my backyard. So I grew up very, very close to ag. And I also grew up with a family garden that was about a quarter the size of a football field. So we did grow corn, peppers, tomatoes, cantaloupes, watermelons, strawberries. My mother canned everything. And so I like to tell people that, we were basically subsistence farmers. I didn't necessarily enjoy a day of working with the rototiller in that field every summer. But I knew what real agriculture looked like, and I knew what we were doing was not it. We were also all organic because we had child labor, which was me and my brothers. Yeah. So, I thought that, the last thing I ever was going to do was be involved in anything that looked like agriculture. But, I went away to grad school. I studied international law and environmental policy. And I thought, I want to work on global forest issues and things like that. And I went to work for the U.S. Department of State. And I ended up in the Office of Food Policy, though, instead of the Office of Environmental Science. And it didn't take me long to realize that all the things that I cared about in terms of water and forest and everything were most impacted by ag. And that if the part of the State Department that dealt with forest and climate and all those things didn't do ag. And so I realized that in order to protect the forest and other things, you need to make sure that people are sustainably and nutritiously fed. Mm-hmm. And if you do that, a lot of the problems actually go away. And so, I became very passionate, have spent the last, 20 plus years figuring out how do we sustainably and nutritiously feed people and how do we allow the rest of it to take care of itself because we're doing a good job.
Yeah. So, you and I, like I said, we have some good creative disagreement. But there's the other thing that we agree upon. First off, if you asked the average person to define the word sustainable, you ask 100 people, you get 100 different answers. For some people, sustainable means small, it means quaint, it means organic, it means farmers markets, it means whatever. And the reality is modern agriculture is more sustainable than it's ever been. For the 10,000-year history, we are producing food calories with less resources than we ever have, less natural resources per calorie produced than has ever happened in 10,000 years. And you say, well, why should an environmentalist care? An environmentalist should applaud that, because that means less degradation of the environment, less acres that we need to use, et cetera, et cetera. And you get that. I'm not sure that most people do. And when you say about nutritiously feeding people, we know that ag has an outsized impact on the environment. We know that. We use a lot of acres, we use water, we do all that stuff. But what is our alternative? And so that's why when these people in these poor countries are degrading their environment, it's because they're starving. When you're starving, you'll do whatever it takes to eat, right? If it means burning down the forest and planting some crops, that's what you do, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you look at the places that, are the most developed and are producing the most food, in terms of intensification, they're also expanding their forests, so North America, Europe, places like that, that have been farming for a very long time, they're also expanding forest. And so, there's that sustainable intensification. But, I think, on one hand, we need to be more intensive in how we produce food, but we also need to do it better, every year. And I think that's where there's a little bit of a mismatch, is that for consumers, when they think about sustainability, they think using less water, less fertilizer, less insecticide equals more sustainable. And that may be true for that small farm, but the problem is that you're going to produce less food because there's a reason farmers use inputs, and somebody else someplace else is going to have to make up the difference. And usually it's a place that is less capable of doing it in a sustainable way. And, I think Europe is a perfect example of this, that, Europe is pushing for reductions in fertilizer, insecticides, and 25% organic by 2030 under their farm to fork strategy. And the country that sends the most food to Europe is Brazil. And so in many ways, Europe is exporting its environmental footprint to arguably the most biodiverse country on the planet. And that might not be a great idea.
And, the average consumer doesn't really think that. And if you even ask the average affluent suburbanite in the United States of America, oh, we were in Europe and it's just so beautiful. And here's the rules that they have. And there's almost an ignorance factor. Like, yeah, they might be anti-GMO, but they truck in barge after barge of genetically engineered soybeans from Brazil. So, like you said, all they've really done is supplant or, is offshore. They've offshored their environmental degradation that agriculture is doing in places like you say in Brazil.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I think, what I try to remind people is if we were farming today the way we did in 1960, we would need 1 billion additional hectares of land in order to feed the people we do. And that's more than a quarter of all the forest left on the planet. So without that improvements in agriculture in terms of technology, innovation, and management practices, we would have 1/4 fewer, land.
Yeah.
And so,
and by the way, you're trying to show us that you're European using the word hectare. A hectare, the poor listener that doesn't know what a hectare is. A hectare is about what, 2.4 acres?
Yeah, that's right. But I just don't know the math in terms of, I know it's a quarter of all the land.
Yeah. So the point is it's a whole bunch. And I find it interesting that, it was one of the group, maybe World Wildlife Fund. There's one of the organizations that actually doesn't have their head up their ass. They're not just going out beating the drum that agriculture is bad, and they actually say we need the kind of agriculture that North America has, because only through that will we indeed then not keep grabbing more acres, as you say. And I believe it was a few years ago I read there are more forested acres now in the United States of America than there were 100 years ago. So, we're coming out of World War I, time frame. We're talking about 100 years ago. There was more wooded acres in the United States today than there were 100 years ago. And I've read that a couple of times. You have as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anybody who's hiked the Appalachian Trail or, gone to Western Virginia, all of those mountaintops were all cut down. That was, all denuded. And now, those are forests where, people go, on the weekends and, nobody realizes what it looked like, not that long ago.
I can even take you to little patches around here, the kind of patches that we farmed 40 years ago when I was a kid, that now are wooded because they weren't that great a farm ground anyhow. They were odd shaped, small, whatever, rocky, and the best and highest and best use for them ended up going into CRP program and have trees planted on them. So we're doing okay in agriculture, and you and I are big fans of the things that we are doing. What are we doing wrong? What is it that the environmental groups, when they actually complain about us, what are they actually accurately complaining about us? What are we doing wrong?
Well, I mean, the reality is, of course, I mean, there's eutrophication of waterway, there's a lot of nutrients that end up in the water that should, we've got dead zones in the Gulf. We've got, 80% of deforestation is caused by agriculture's expansion. So, there are a lot of things that are happening because of agriculture, methane from cows and other things. So the question isn't, are there problems? Absolutely, there are problems. The question is the framing of the problem. Is agriculture the problem that needs to be solved, or is agriculture potentially the solution to the problem?
Don't you have a speech or a book titled something like that? Can agriculture save the world or something?
Yeah, well, one of my standard talk, Can Agriculture Save the Planet? And, I just think it's really important, though, because if you say that, agriculture is the problem and farmers are the problem, why in the world are they going to work with you in order to solve the problem? Right. On the other hand, if you say, look, you guys have done an amazing job, agriculture today is wildly better than it was 30 or 40 years ago. It will be wildly better 30 or 40 years from now. But if we work together, we can accelerate that improvement. Together, we can actually get to that more sustainable future, by 2030, instead of having to wait until 2050. So it's, are you working together, or are you sort of working at odds? And so, we definitely need to address, eutrophication of water. I mean, there's some clear problems, and that's because they're also shared goals. Nutrients in the water is money out of the pocket of the farmer. Yeah. So the interest of the conservationists and the farmer are very often very aligned.
Yeah, and the thing is, there are people in our industry that wouldn't think that, and there's certainly people that are outside of ag, which is most of the people, most of humanity, and at least most of North America does not work in our industry, wouldn't understand that. Dead zones in the Gulf. You talked about this. I just read an article here in the last week about the amount of fertilizer and fertility that we've lost, and I think it was just the state of Illinois as an example. In fact, it might have been a state of Illinois or a University of Illinois study, whatever it was. And you're talking about a lot of these nutrients that we spend money on, and right now more than ever, with these fertility prices are, just watched a webinar, anhydrous is up 144% year over year. This is real issues. But anyway, we got a lot of fertilizer that ends up going down the Mississippi, and then what it ends up doing down there is creating all kinds of problems. And then, like you said, we got some dead zones in the Gulf, and unfortunately, that looks like it's agriculture caused this. It wasn't a plutonium mine. It was us, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's the reality. And so, how do we keep those nutrients out of the water in a way that has a return on the investment for the farmer? And we've seen some improvements. If you look at the Chesapeake today versus where it was 20 or 30 years ago, and a lot of that has to do with partnerships with the Nature Conservancy, which is my day job now as Director of Global Food and Water Policy, and they have worked with growers and producers. And so the Nature Conservancy, for your listeners who are not familiar with it, it's the world's largest conservation organization, established in 1951, has projects and programs in 76 countries around the world. But by far our biggest outreach and network is in the United States. We're in all 50 states. And we have 500,000 acres under management of the Nature Conservancy. So, I mean, we're walking the walk along with the producers and grazers and others that are out there, and trying to help them to ensure that they can make a living, and that they leave their farm or their land better than when they found it. And we recognize that has to be socially and culturally relevant in order to get people to make those changes. Yeah.
So the Nature Conservancy, when I think of, I don't think of them often, but we see environmentally oriented groups that then generally are anti-agriculture. I mean, the Sierra Club, the Audubon Society, we can go on and on. A National Wildlife Federation, I think it was, opposed ethanol. In fact, funded a study to come out anti-ethanol, and what the hell why is a wildlife group involved with ethanol discussions anyway? But you see this thing, and I think it was one of those groups, maybe like the Sierra Club or Audubon Society. I think it was Sierra Club, Jack, that wanted to end all grazing on public lands. And of course, the agriculture people are saying, but this grazing, it's not just that we're making so much money off of it. It's actually a management technique because, you can prevent some forest fires and some things like that because of the way we manage it. But I don't think of the Nature Conservancy as being opposed to us, but I don't know that I would have ever brought them into agriculture. So why did they hire you? What are you going to do as their director of whatever you are for the Nature Conservancy?
Well, many of the people, if not most of the people that work for the Nature Conservancy, are scientists that are working on the ground with, people across the United States and around the world to help make their farms more sustainable. So, that's most of what the Nature Conservancy is doing, projects on the ground, working with people. They're also looking at, how to site facilities, so it might be working with companies on, siting for water and other things. But, for me, I was interested in how do we scale good ideas? How do we ensure that at the same time that we're producing more food, that we do it in a way that ensures that the land is there for future generations as well. And that's future generations of farmers, not just, for consumers. And I see, when I look, into the future, I see that, we will get better every day, but that there are things that we could do to spread those good ideas more quickly if conservation organizations were working with those producers and were helping to scale those ideas. Because a lot of things just take time, like cover crops, just as an example, that, you're going to have to be able to convince, farmers that there's a return on the investment if you want them to do it. Well, if we as conservationists believe that it's a good idea, well, why can't we go out and raise money to help ensure that, maybe you cover the cost for the farmer, he gets to try it. 5 years later, we have the data to know whether it was a good idea or not. So, farmers shouldn't take that added risk if we don't know there's a return on that investment. On the other hand, that's a perfectly reasonable thing for a conservation organization to go out and fundraise for, to prove it, so that we don't have to wait so long for those ideas to scale. And this could be drip irrigation. This could be robotics. This could be, AI. I mean, there are lots of things that we could do to help proof of concept. And that's what they're doing on the ground. And my job is to say, okay, if it works on the ground, how do we ensure that when the Convention on Biological Diversity gathers these environmental ministers to talk about international environmental treaties, that there is a place and a space within those groups that doesn't just say, we're going to cut pesticides by 50% by 2030. It's, we're going to reduce the impact of pesticides on the environment while maintaining and growing production, that we have that balance in there.
I want to hear more about some of these projects specifically. Before we get to that, I want to take a moment here for our good friends at Pattern Ag, one of our new sponsors, and they also have a great product that you should consider trying. A question for farmers and agricultural landowners. Have you ever lost yield to unexpected pest or disease? Well, of course you have, because every season you're forced to guess about some of the most important management decisions. But now you don't have to guess. Pattern Ag offers the most advanced soil analysis available today. In addition to a comprehensive nutrient analysis, like any soil survey is going to do for you, Pattern can predict next season's risk from the most damaging of pests and diseases, including corn rootworm, soybean cyst nematode, sudden death syndrome, and more. So for the first time ever, a single soil analysis can help you optimize your crop protection and fertility spend at a subfield, field, and operational level. Time to refine your management decisions. Time to optimize your inputs and maximize your yield. Simply go to www.pattern.ag and get started today. All right, so we're back here talking to Jack Bobo about the Nature Conservancy, and we're talking about what happens when these organizations actually work with the agriculturalists and the business of agriculture versus working against them. So projects that you're talking about, Nature Conservancy, you mentioned cover crops. I believe that we should do more cover cropping. It's good for the ground. Why we allow our most valuable asset in agriculture, soil, which is now selling for like $12,000 an acre in my part of the world. Why we allow that to just be barren. In fact, to be tilled up for 6 months during the winter, to be blown away and washed away, I think is really long-term. We're going to look back and say, why did we do that? Well, the tough part is making cover crops work in certain climatological areas, like where I am in northern Indiana. It doesn't always work out. You know, you can't get it quite established while your crop is still growing, and then you come into a wet spring. There's always some issues. That's why it hasn't caught on more. So for it to catch on, it would be good for the ground. It would be good for carbon sequestration if that's the new thing, but it's not quite there as a good business model yet. So are you going to see a time when the Nature Conservancy says for every acre you put a cover crop on, we're going to incentivize you financially? Is that what's going to happen?
Well, I mean, I don't think the Nature Conservancy is going to provide that incentive, but it doesn't mean that we can't go out and work for find grants and sponsors and others who say, let's give it a try and let's figure out how to do it at scale. And or we work with seed producers and say, okay, the kind of cover crop that's right for Alabama, turns out it's not right for in northern Indiana. And so let's find the right cover crop. And once we find the right cover crop, then you can work with the seed companies to improve that cover crop so that, it's, maximizes, whatever dimensions you need. And so, that as a catalytic partner, I think is something that we can do. And, we just have a different voice when we're talking to the government saying, yeah, you really need to, subsidize cover crops, or you need to provide insurance benefits. So, if somebody used a cover crop, maybe they get a discount on their insurance. There are different ways of incentivizing that don't require, a cash payment.
Got it. What do you think? What would the Nature Conservancy as an organization, what would they like? What would they like to see out of agriculture? We use the word sustainable. Again, it means 100 things to 100 different people. What does the Nature Conservancy want from us?
Well, I mean, I think we want farmers to be able to, be better in terms of reducing their soil erosion, reducing the nutrient runoff, maximizing yields and productivity, soil retention, all of the things that are good business are the things that we would like you to do more of.
Sure.
And it's not that you're not doing it. Like I said, I mean, it's being done and it's improving, but, we need to get there faster. And so it's how do we improve dissemination of new and good ideas so that they just make more sense to adopt at a faster rate.
Tell me what you see in the next. So I think that agriculture is going to continue to get amazingly good at stuff. We're already doing less resources. The necessities the mother of invention. These high fertilizer prices, or even lack of availability with the whole situation with the Black Sea and Ukraine and what's going on right now, I think it's going to make us use less stuff and still get really good yields. I think we're going to be using some biologicals. We're going to be doing some stuff to get more fertility out of the soil that's there. Whereas in the old days when fertilizer was cheap, we just went out and flinged it everywhere. I think that that's what's going to happen. And I'm not sure the Nature Conservancy is going to be the reason. I think it's going to be just economic necessity. What are your thoughts?
Well, all of the improvements have been economic necessity. So, I'm not giving the Nature Conservancy credit for those things, but I do think that, many farmers are conservative by nature. They're not going to do something unless they really know they're going to get a return on that investment. Yeah. And so by helping to cover that transition cost, or by, working with people to get those ideas from, the research area, from Purdue, from other places into the field, partnering with other organizations to make sure that what these new companies are saying are going to happen with biologicals really gets that return on that investment. I mean, it's, we're not just saying throw everything at the wall. We're saying, let's make sure things work. And once we know they work, let's get them out there as fast as possible, because we're not supporting any particular product or technology or company or anything like that.
Got it. What do you think? What do you think are right now? What do you think agriculture, looking at it from the perspective you have, what is it that needs what's most glaring right now? What's our most glaring need right now? What should be our focus right now?
Well, I'm not one for telling people what they should do. I feel like there are a lot of things that can be done. I think part of it is that, agriculture needs to be part of these conversations. One, you can't just stick your head in the sand and say, I don't really care what the consumer thinks. I don't really care what the government wants me to do. I think they should look at it and say, we acknowledge that there are some challenges out there, and let's work with organizations that are reasonable, that, want to work with us to try to solve those problems. So, acknowledging real problems, I think, is important. And it's not because, they're the bad guy, but it's because, they have the greatest potential to actually improve these situations. They're right in the middle of it. Agriculture is in the middle of, lots of issues globally right now. And I think people are more and more aware of the central role that agriculture plays.
So your role within the Nature Conservancy, then, when they brought you in, what was the objective? Why do you think they hired Jack Bobo?
Well, I think part of it is that I think how I talk about these issues, my goal is to bring people together to solve problems. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, a lot of conservation organizations historically, the language they've used has just turned people off. And, if I keep telling you, it's like, well, these are all the things you should do to improve agriculture, and, like you said, it's like, Jack, you have no background. Why are you telling me what I should do? On the other hand, if I came on here and I said, well, here are 10 things that a farmer could do to improve, they might be like, well, maybe I'll look into that, because it's, giving them ideas, because everybody wants to do better. They're all busy. And if somebody can help make those decisions easier, I think people would adopt it, but certainly not from somebody who's, insulting them or saying that they're evil or somehow destroying the planet. That's just not going to work. So I think it's really because, I'm thinking very hard about how do we communicate with people and bring them together.
You mentioned that the Nature Conservancy has 500,000 acres that the organization owns. So grandma croaks and she leaves $1 million to the Nature Conservancy, and they pay you, and then they also go out and deploy this money buying acres. I'm a farmer. I own farm ground. If I was at the auction, I was bidding against the Nature Conservancy, I'd hate the Nature Conservancy, because why are you competing with me to take this ground? So that's one angle. Also, what are they doing with it? Why does the Nature Conservancy want 500,000 acres?
Yeah, well, they want to see what they can do in order to improve the land management on that land, so then they can share those ideas with others. So, I mean, it's absolutely, and, you can't just have, 50 acres in one part of the country and think that you can, use that as a model for what's happening across America. I mean, it's a big country, and it's, it's very different. Like you said, Indiana is different from other parts. And so they need to be able to do real research on real land, real working, grazing lands, in order to come up with, data and science that is then applicable to, a broad range of landscapes.
Mm-hmm. So are these acres being operated for production agriculture?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, these are not, taken out of production and, conservation easements and things like that. So in some ways, that's more of where the Nature Conservancy got started. It was, let's buy up land and, protect it.
Yeah.
And, over time, there's been that recognition that, we need to use some of this land in order to produce the food. And so the Nature Conservancy, is now organized structurally. So we've got our protect team, which is, about how do we protect those forests and other things. But we also have our provide team, which is the team that I support, which is really aimed at, how do we ensure that, food is produced that meet all of our needs in a way that's, sustainable and nutritious, and that actually reduces the pressure on that, protect team to have to protect, that land.
I'm trying to think of then on these acres. So is it reasonable that that they say, okay, you're a farmer down the road, and we're going to have you operate these acres, but you're going to do it with these with these practices? Is that kind of what happens?
So certainly the Nature Conservancy is not developing standards that we expect others to follow. What we're doing is we're coming up with ideas and practices which we invite others to, to use, but we're not saying you have to have these in order to get Nature Conservancy seal, that's not us. We're not creating standards that, or expectations. We are doing the science that gives ideas that, can then be disseminated. Mm-hmm. Others are focused on standards, and we engage in conversations around that because if standards are adopted, we want them to provide the right incentives, and that we see that happening in Europe right now. There are a lot of sustainability standards that for my purposes will potentially deliver reduced impact in Europe, but may increase impact other places. And that's not the sort of thing we want to do. We want to avoid, sending our problems someplace else.
Yeah, like we just talked, the Brazil example is a great example. Yeah. Well, the person, the suburban Parisian can feel very good that they supported the farm to fork, initiative instituted by the European Union. But like you said, that just offshored the agriculture to another country where their standards are actually quite different. In fact, it's probably more degrading to the environment on a per acre basis than it would have been in Europe by a lot.
Yeah, wildly. I mean, there's a huge difference between, farming a acre of land that's been farmed for, 100 or 1,000 years versus cutting down a forest. I mean, just the emissions from cutting that down, doesn't matter how sustainably you farm that land after you've cut down the forest, you'll never recover from that moment.
I've been involved in meetings where they said that Brazil is not going to cut any more timber, and that's the deal, that there's not going to be acres deforested for agricultural purposes in Brazil. Is that true?
Brazil continues to be, one of two of the largest deforesters on the planet. So in at least historically, if you were to exclude Indonesia and Brazil from, deforestation numbers, global forests are actually pretty much level or growing.
Yeah, like I said, places like the United States, we're planting trees, and it's just that Brazil and Indonesia are gobbling it up faster than we can plant it. So, are they leveled off and stopped, or you think they're still cutting it down?
Still cutting it down. And that comes back to demand, right? I mean, if there wasn't demand for palm oil, then there would be no deforestation in Indonesia. If there wasn't demand for soybeans and beef, Brazil would have no need to cut anything down.
A lot of these organizations, but a lot of these organizations, nonprofit, environmentally minded, push a vegan lifestyle. It's not natural. Humans are omnivorous. It seems like an interesting thing that they take on, but then it becomes kind of their cause. Almost like then they're almost as like they're almost like a vegan group then instead of just a environmental group. Is this an observation that only I've had, or is this something you've observed as well?
Yeah, well, certainly, people who are vegan are extremely passionate about it, and they want to spread their views. And it's almost certainly true that, a vegan diet is going to have a lower environmental impact, if you're not producing meat, but, there's also the nutritional aspects of meat. It allows, it's an easier diet for most people. Most people, it is extremely complicated to eat nutritiously on, a fixed budget anyway, with a vegan lifestyle. So the Nature Conservancy, certainly doesn't take any position on, lifestyle and, consumption. Our view is that if you can improve all of agriculture, you will get a lot of those benefits. The whole point of my book is that, Americans, though, eat about 200 calories more per day than we did in 1970. So, think about that. We could, if we were eating the same amount as we did in 1970, 10% of food consumption would disappear overnight. So we could talk about beef, we could talk about other things, but, that's a pretty dramatic change. And, certainly as an organization, we're focused on food waste and other things that we can do, because those things don't help anybody. Right. And so, and sort of the final point would be that a lot of the arguments for veganism are counterproductive, because what they really do is they set up this, divisiveness. Mm-hmm. And for the average person, if somebody says, you're evil for eating meat, they will go out and eat a double quarter pounder just to stick it to them. And so, that creates that reactance that, is actually counterproductive. And so, could we be eating more nutritiously? Absolutely. Should we all be eating more fruits and vegetables? Absolutely. But even if Americans chose to eat less meat, that doesn't mean American producers should produce less meat.
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
because
we're very good at it. The feed yard,
good at it.
The feed yards in Nebraska that get maligned by environmental groups, that's the most efficient means of producing beef in the world. It just is. And we've got the ability to do so versus grazing forests that obviously end up degrading the whole forest. So, yeah.
Right.
Um,
But we can do that better, right? Because we don't want the nutrients from those CAFOs to end up in water. If we can provide feed that reduces methane emissions from that cattle, fantastic, right? So, yeah.
By the way, I think that we're going to see more of that. I've worked with some companies, in fact, that are working on, they tinker with rations all the time to make it so that but you wonder, that's the reality, that we're making it so we are feeding a ration that creates less methane. But does the consumer, even if we accomplish that, has there been so much maligning of beef that it's, even if we get to where we're zero emission, the connotation that beef is evil will stay with us? What do you think?
Well, certainly the conversation will probably continue. But I think what's important to realize is that, Americans, or, people in general, they like eating livestock products, so they want permission to do it. And so if you could address the problems, then you're basically giving them permission to do what they already want to do, which is much easier than to convince people to do something they don't want to do. So I think that a lot of the concerns go away. Some people may continue, for ethical reasons or animal welfare reasons or other things to fight for it. But I mean, I think if we actually addressed a lot of those environmental concerns, a lot of the pressure would disappear.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I think that then there's the other thing. I mean, I'm not saying this about the Nature Conservancy, but there are organizations that they need a cause. And so when the organization doesn't have, like I say, Greenpeace was begun 50 years ago to oppose whaling.
Yeah.
The last three countries, Norway, Japan, and Russia, haven't even had whaling fleets in the last 20 years. So what the hell? Greenpeace, you accomplished your goal. There's no more commercial whaling. Oh, wait a minute. We don't want to have to get jobs because we're Greenpeace. So they just found a new cause. I wonder if that's going to be the case with agriculture. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think it's going to be a while before we, reduce the impact to zero. So, it's going to take a while to reduce deforestation, eutrophication of water. I mean, and that's not to say that things aren't, better in many, many ways. Right. Rivers today in America, are much cleaner than they were back in the 1960s and 70s. Rivers were catching on fire,
Sure, right.
For goodness sakes.
Yeah. So the Cuyahoga River, caught on fire 50 years ago, 45 years ago, and now it's clean, right?
Yeah. So, Love Canal. Yeah.
So we're getting there. Like I said, ideally, we keep getting there and we keep getting better and better and better. Does the Nature Conservancy play a role in that? You said you're sharing ideas, et cetera, et cetera. What can the Nature Conservancy take credit for? One, that seems like they're not anti-agriculture the way some of the other organizations are. What else?
Well, I mentioned the Chesapeake Bay. They've been working for 20 years with those communities in order to create the incentives, and things are wildly better. And I think, many of the farmers in that region would say that the organization played a positive role in helping us to get where we are. And part of that is as an honest broker, that there is a lot of trust among, consumers for some of these conservation organizations. And if they're saying these new practices are good, or that, we're working towards a goal, I think it often makes a difference versus, farmers saying, we work every day to make the world better. We're feeding the world. That doesn't necessarily resonate with your average consumer in the way that it would if, a different voice, some third party validator out there, making some of those messages. And that's why the collaboration is so important. Is, I often joke that, at the State Department, at USDA, they do things. And when I was at the State Department, we talk about doing things, I'm still doing that. I'm talking about what the Nature Conservancy is doing on the ground and what farmers are doing on the ground. But, that talking about it is actually pretty important in order to to ensure that we have the space in order to bring these ideas forward. It's trust is in short supply these days, and you need that social license in order to operate.
Do you think the Nature Conservancy will ever end up being like this thing that they endorse certain things? I mean, is it going to be that we need their endorsement because they are known? Hey, the Nature Conservancy says this is okay. This is American beef, which is better for the environment than beef produced in a third world country where they tear down the forest. You ever see that happening?
I doubt that. What I do see is that, we talk about practices being different in different places, and that, it might not be a good idea to reduce those, production in the United States. I've gotten into lots of Twitter battles with people, that, when I've pointed out that, even if American meat consumption went down, that doesn't mean we should be reducing production, because if we do, somebody else will step up. And, Europe, is just that prime example. Almost everything they're doing will reduce production by 8 to 10% over the next, 10 years. And, that's going to dramatically increase the global footprint of ag, in a very negative way. And so as an organization, I think we're not saying that what Europe is trying to do is wrong, but we're saying that, if you're going to reduce the footprint, you need to maintain the production, that it's not good enough to just reduce production.
Do you think, this is the last point, do you think that we're going to end up doing that in America? Do you think that eventually we become like Europe, where it's this sort of misguided, altruistic, save the world sort of belief, but really what we do, we've done it with manufacturing, right? We don't make light bulbs in the United States anymore because, it's nasty. So we make them in, some in China and ship them over here. Is that going to happen to food?
Well, I think that if consumers, obviously, science tells us what we can do. It's the public that tells us what we should do. So as a producer, you're only going to produce what people are willing to buy. And if people, won't buy the things that are sustainably produced, then you'll change your practices. But that's where, we absolutely have to have conversations with the food companies as well, because it's how they market the things to the consumer, that determines whether or not consumers, want this type of product or that type of product. And right now, consumers are really focused on reducing fertilizer, all of those things. And we need them to understand that there are trade-offs. And those trade-offs are generally impacting the forest and the environment and other things that they actually care about. And so if we don't figure out how to communicate that effectively, then yes, the US may go down a path where we're actually becoming less productive and less efficient and less sustainable.
Yeah. And I mean, it would be foolish to do that. But again, these things are usually not based on what the economics or even science. It becomes issues. Political issues become based on feelings, right?
Yeah.
And that's
absolutely.
There. What else you got for me? I'm going to close it out here. Otherwise, I mean, I'm glad you came on here.
Well, no, it's been great. And, we
didn't even fight. We didn't even have anything we scrapped over, did we?
No, not this time. Well, I'll come back when you think of something to disagree with me about.
His name's Jack Bobo, and he's a sharp dude. And like I said, we bump into one another on the road. If they want to find you, where do they find you?
So you can find me on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect. Also on Twitter at Jack_A_Bobo. And let's continue the conversation wherever you guys are willing to meet up with me.
He does put some pretty good stuff on LinkedIn, so I encourage you to go there. He and I keep up with one another, and you know what? We see each other on the road once in a while. And the next time he's going to buy the drinks because I bought him drinks last time. So anyway, hey man, thanks for being on here.
Thank you.
All right, till next time, it's the Business of Agriculture.
This episode of The Business of Agriculture was brought to you by Nori. If you're feeling left out of carbon markets, Nori is a carbon removal marketplace that welcomes early adopters of regenerative farming. We work directly with farmers to enter their data and project their carbon credits, which the farmer owns and sets the price on. Nori is the marketplace, not the middleman, so farmers get paid directly once their credits are sold. We believe that carbon credits should be an asset the farmer controls, not the rights that they sell. To learn more on how you can enroll your farm, visit nori.com/growers. And if you are a company looking to get involved with carbon markets, reach out to hello@nori.com. Nori, a carbon marketplace for early adopters. Visit nori.com/growers.